Well, hello. I want to welcome everybody to the People's Food Summit 2024. And today I'm having a discussion with one of the true pioneers of the organic sector in Australia, but also internationally. I'd like to introduce you to Tim Marshall. And Tim, if you want to, I just like you to start with how you became involved in the organic sector.
Well, back in the days of our youth, Andre, the internet didn't exist. So most people got their information in those days from local organisations. And I found my local organisation, which was the Soil Association of South Australia, had been originally an offshoot of the British Soil Association. And then as it gathered membership, the locals decided to start their own organisation, and that was a small group, but of mainly practicing farmers in those days. And then I attended their first public event at an agricultural high school in the Adelaide Hills, and joined, and very quickly became the secretary of the Soil Association. So that's what got me absolutely immersed in organic.
Yeah, your story is actually a very similar one for a lot of people our age. You know, for me, I live about 3,000 kilometers away from you in Northern Australia, but we had a similar organization. We called it the Healthy Soil Association, and it was a handful of farmers, it's all farmers, and it started originally in the 1930s, about the same time as the UK Soil Association. And it's actually very important for me because I actually got my experience working on one of these farms in 1973, and that's how I learned organic growing. But I think what people uh, would really like to know, and you are actually actively involved in this, is that the original societies were all called soil associations of one
Yes.
type or another. But out of that, the modern organic movement was born. Would you like to talk about how that happened in South Australia?
Yeah, well, first I'll say that prior to me, just about all the active people were farmers. And as people like you and I came along, I think the previous motivation for a lot of people would have been a religious sort of conviction. But after Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, the character of that movement changed a little bit, and it was tended to be younger people with a little bit more education, perhaps, and a slightly different perspective. But we were wedded to the old, what I call a Lady Eve Balfour view of organic, which is that the soil is absolutely fundamental. And that to me remains very important. It remains important to the iPhone world. Most of my colleagues around the world, that the soil is absolutely fundamental. And interestingly, a lot of the views that we had back in those days were considered by the conventional agronomists to be completely nuts, and they didn't think that organic operators would survive. But of course, a lot of new science, the science of the soil microbiome and the human microbiome, actually fundamentally based on those soil principles. The next thing that I did after joining the Soil Association was run the first scientific conference on organic farming in the Southern Hemisphere with my Soil Association colleagues. And a very important event happened at that conference. A colleague, Sandy Fritz, came along around a workshop on why we should have a national organisation, because as you suggested, at that stage there were small, local, state-based or regional-based organic organisations. Then there wasn't anything national. And so after that workshop, at that workshop, we set up what we call the steering committee, and worked our butts off for about 2.5, 3 years. And eventually we, through contacting all our friends in the organisations around the country, we started an organisation called NASA. And NASA came to be the first national organic organisation, and eventually the first organic certification body and first standards owner in the Southern Hemisphere. So that was a pretty significant event,
Yeah.
And I continue to be involved in NASA to this day.
Yeah. Well, you actually became the first chair of NASA, which I think is very important. So you had a
Yeah.
leading role. And what you were doing also, the same thing was happening in Europe at the time, in the US, in South Africa, um, India, around the world was now the formation of these national organizations. And, you know, in iPhone, we now say this is the change from what we call organic 1.0, which is the original handful of farmer pioneers, through to organic 2.0, which is the beginning of codifying organic into standards and certification or ensuring the veracity of products labeled as organic. And once again, you are one of the leaders in this, not just in Australia, but also with iPhone globally.
I think a big difference between now and then is that now you can regard organic as just another option in the supermarket. So it's just as you can buy halal, and you can buy gluten-free, and you can buy organic. But in those days, it was so out of the mainstream that you had to have a certain level of commitment, because the farmers, if they went to the tennis club, they didn't necessarily want to say I'm an organic farmer because they could be criticised. So to be committed, 45 years ago, you had to have a sort of value-based and moral connection to what you were doing. So that is what allowed that movement then to grow so very quickly and very rapidly, was the commitment of myself, yourself, and our many colleagues.
Yeah. Look, actually, that's a really important point. And so, from my point of view as a farmer, we were ridiculed. We were regarded as nutcases.
Yeah.
Talking about things like healthy soil. Um, Even as 15 years ago, I wrote a peer-reviewed paper, and one of the peer reviewers wanted to get rid of the idea of soil health. I said it's not a scientific term, and that sort of attitude. But the other one is, me being, one of the few organic farmers in our district, we were the subject of ridicule from all the other farmers, to the point that my kids got teased and got a hard time in school. And I remember when I do media interviews, I did a lot of media, and they want to take photographs of the family. My children did not want to be in the photographs because they thought they'd be ridiculed. It's a different story now, but then
Yeah.
um, we faced every level of ridicule. And then in your case, when you're now starting to take these systems to government, there was that other level of ridicule or being ignored, not taken seriously. Do you want to talk about that? Because one of the things that you were also instrumental in is getting the first regulatory system in Australia.
Well, at that time, it was an era of where there was a slightly different approach to government. There was an interest in involving industry in that era. The Department of Agriculture didn't want to know about us because nobody in that organisation had been trained or understood organic, and they were deeply sceptical. But the trade organisations and were interested. They realised that there was the potential for a developing market, and so government was interested in facilitating trade, especially between Australia and Europe. They had a fairly hands-off approach at that time. It was like, yep, you can go and do this. Please do it yourself. Government doesn't want to get involved with that. And so we did that largely by ourselves. We worked out how we were going to run these certification systems. And at that stage, the Soil Association and NASA were in touch with the early certifiers, so the British Soil Association, Naturland, CCOF, and those organisations. We exchanged a lot of information and worked out how we were going to put this thing together. It was slightly different approach to quality management was coming into vogue in that era, but that all consisted of sort of end product assessments, like, at the end of the production line, you'd make sure that the 9mm bolt and the 9mm nut would fit together. With organic, because you can't necessarily take an organic orange and measure its organicness, it's very hard to do that. We had a process focus, and that was entirely new. It took government a little while to work out how they were going to do that. Interestingly, in Australia, one of our main colleagues was actually the meat industry, because they were working out that ear tags and traceability of animals was the best way to keep a handle on their product quality and origin. So they became one of the models that we could use to point to government and say, look, they're doing it too. This is a legitimate way of constructing the verification process.
Yeah. And I think what is very interesting here, because you did work with the early certifiers and the Soil Association, which, to let everybody know, was also one of the early certifiers in the
Yes.
UK.
Yeah.
CCOF, which is in those days is California based, but it's actually one of the also the world's largest certifiers. So what was happening here was consistent, which is what was happening in all the major, or if you say, with the major organic movement at the time.
It was very important to connect with those organisations because we were doing something that was totally new, and this sense of having, colleagues around the world and working out something that we knew would become a worldwide system was really critical. So in the case of NASA, we collected the early documentation of all of those organisations, only about 5 or 6 that were really doing a terrific job. The Soil Association was probably the absolute model, and NASA became the first Southern Hemisphere organisation. And interestingly, one of the things that caused NASA to really go ahead was that we launched at about exactly the time that Australian beef exports to the US were banned for a short time because the American authorities found DDT residues. So that gave us a media platform that we could not have bought with any amount of money. And so, a few of us who showed some promise at being able to talk to media did a lot of work, and I'm sure you did some of that at that time, where a few voices around Australia managed to, get into all the rural media, uh, all the foodie media, and some of the general media, just to, there was a whole lot of other chemical issues at that time. There was an issue around ALAR in apples. There were issues of chemical trespass with aerial application, and so there was a bit of a focus, and that the importance of Rachel Carson's whistleblower book, of course, can't be ignored as well.
Yeah, look, that book, Silent Spring, is such an important book. And what a lot of people don't realize is that where she got most of her information from was actually the UK Soil Association. And they
Yeah,
helped her
yeah,
write it, put it out, and that started the organic consumer movement. Before that, it was largely, a few very small amount of farmers like myself. But when that came out, we now had consumers and a market, and the whole organic sector grew incredibly quickly. And after that, we actually, because there was the interest, and this is a big issue, we could get the publicity then. And I'm
mm,
one of the people who's been very actively involved in pesticides. That was a good time for us.
yes,
Now, because of the censorship of the media, it's virtually impossible to get up any of those issues now. We were
yes.
very lucky we actually had that window.
Interesting. In Australia now, we no longer have a full-time pesticide campaigner anywhere in the country, which is very, very sad. Um, yeah. Um,
Yeah. And I suppose the other thing now, maybe I just want to go forward because you were involved in many, many organizations in the growth of the industry. And while you were doing that, Australia was actually one of the leading countries, and particularly NASA. You're up there with, the great organizations that actually, um, how can you say, um, formulated organic as we know it, help that whole codification, help the promotion of it. NASA was a leader, not just in Australia, but globally.
I think the quality of many of my colleagues had a lot to do with that. We had to work out how to do this, and we had a group of inspectors at that time. It involved, the great Rod May, who we all deeply miss, Liz Clay, who
Yes.
became an iFame board member, and others. And I think because of that commitment, we did a lot of homework. So if we'd never been to a flour mill before, we've never gone to a brewery or winery or whatever it was, or a dairy before, we invested quite a bit of time and found out about that. And that, look, it led to some very interesting stories. I remember the first milk certification that we did in Australia for delivery of milk. We spent a good 3 or 4 months probably talking to the laboratory people in that organization, who were petrified that they were going to bring in this contaminated organic milk into their factory. And eventually, we sent two of their lab people down to Fish Creek, to this fantastic, absolutely inspirational dairy. And they came back and they said, we've never seen a cleaner dairy in our history of working in this industry, and that operator used only one single cleaning product, which was cider vinegar. And it was a deep shock to them to realise that there was another way of doing this that really was completely outside their ken, and none of their studies had introduced them to how that might be done.
Another example of that is the export of organic grains, wheat. Um, they were all previously sprayed with organophosphates, particularly
Mm.
malathion, so all toxic. And the organic sector pioneered using carbon dioxide as a modified atmosphere to kill all the pests and to export them through to Europe.
Another interesting story, some of the first biodynamic apples that we sent to Europe turned out to have a pesticide residue, and that was rather shocking for everybody. And we realized that what had happened is in the positioning of the containerized system that contained the organic apples, they were at the end of the air distribution system. So the air had gone through the containers holding the non-organic apples and had the air circulation system brought the chemicals with it. So after that discovery, the organic apples always had to go very first in the aeration system in the hold of the ship.
And in my case, because for people to know, I'm an organic tropical fruit grower, someone who produces tons, pallet loads, and we had to make sure that they were in completely sealed plastic bags for that because, you know, we can't fill up a whole container load of organic fruit. So I've got to go in the organic with the non-organic bananas or mangoes, and they're all sprayed. And unless the consignments were fully sealed, all my organic produce would end up with all the pesticide residues, particularly in those days, the fungicides.
Of course, there was a legislation at that time that if you transported grapes interstate or overseas, you had to treat them with sulfur.
Yeah,
And so, in building these relationships with government, we had to get them to change some of those requirements. And
yeah,
so, after a bit of investigation, the government ended up saying, if this meets the allowances, conditions for the destination country that we're exporting to, then we'll drop that requirement.
yeah,
And there were a number of other requirements such as that, because of those in those days, for instance, a lot of our produce was sold through boards. As a wheat
yeah,
grower, as a citrus grower, as a potato grower, you were actually not permitted to sell your own produce. You had to sell it through a board,
yeah.
and those boards, being deeply conservative organisations, didn't acknowledge that there was a separate market for organic, didn't think that they should have to pay a premium for a different category of product like organic. And
And
so that became quite a struggle as well.
a big struggle, but there's also one other one that's for exports. And we'll touch on this now. You're involved in the first regulation for organic, and that was an export regulation.
Yes,
And we're supposed to get a domestic regulation not long afterwards, but we still haven't. Um, and both you and I put a
yes,
lot of effort
yes,
into into this. But I just want to say, from my point of view as a farmer, up where I am, because we have to transport fruit thousands of kilometers, that um, all the tropical fruits was those days sprayed with dimethoate and xanthine, things that are actually banned now. We'll get to for fruit fly up here,
mm,
and I I we managed to get an allowance for certified organic that I could get it in on inspections,
yes,
but I still had to put it in consignments of these highly toxic organophosphates,
yes.
and so and wrap it up. But I suppose the issue here, what I want to talk about, is because we had no organic regulation, I couldn't um, domestic regulation. I couldn't get things done where I could transport things without all these chemicals
Yes.
contaminating my
Yeah.
organic produce, unless I spent extra on packaging it. And I
Mm.
think you know, where I would just want to talk about now is that, I'm talking 30 years ago, 40 years ago. almost. And now, actually 40 years down the track, or 30 years, um, I'm still in the same boat.
Mm. Yes.
And, this is a big issue that we need to fix up. And I know you've been very active now on the next phase and what you believe is the appropriate solution to an organic um, domestic regulation. Would you like to just expand on that?
Yes, well, firstly, you're right that I've traced the history of that domestic regulation, and every time there was an announcement when our Minister of Agriculture, John Kerrin, said he was going to establish this committee to give us a regulation. He said, I'm only responsible for export, but I'm going to talk to my colleagues, and we'll make sure this is a domestic regulation." And 3 years later, the Minister of Agriculture, Simon Crean, launched that standard. And he said, "I know I'm not responsible for domestic regulation, but I'll talk to my colleagues and we'll make this domestic." And here we are 35 years later, and we still don't have a regulation. So I do believe that we are looking in the wrong place when we look to the Department of Agriculture to give us that regulation. And that it's really food law in particular that we need to look at, which is in the Australian condition, because we're a federation, is largely to do with the states. So we're looking in a sort of a different direction. We still have a couple of issues to solve. For instance, that food legislation, we may need some special legislation because we now need to cover cosmetics. We need to cover fibers, etc., those sorts of things. But so the secondary issue in Australia becomes which standard. We have an export standard which is law, but it has no currency inside the country. We have an Australian standard, which is the AS 6000, which can have some relevance to the courts, and is probably one of the better managed standard systems across the world, because our chief organisation, Standards Australia, is acknowledged to be one of the leading standard setters. But we need now to merge those two standards and to end up with a single standard and with the best possible governance and management system for that standard, which currently is the one that can be provided by Standards Australia. So that's a big part of our current struggle, is to decide, okay, now is the time when we absolutely need a domestic standard. We need it to protect Australian consumers. We need it so that we can negotiate equivalency arrangements with our major markets across the world, because at the moment we're doing conformity assessment arrangements with individual countries, which is really expensive. It means that if we can get one single standard, we can go to an equivalency arrangement, and that should affect the cost of certification for our certified operators significantly, because we can rely on our government to negotiate a market entry to other countries, rather than individually negotiating with 7 or 8 or 9 different governments.
Yeah. And as you know, but probably most people don't know, is that both you and I, we were actively involved in getting this Standards Australian standard up, on the advice of government that this is the best way
Yes.
forward, because it can be enforced by the courts, and we can do it actually in this case under consumer law. So it was I know from my point of view, it's a very elegant, simple solution. However, the main thing in this case that's held it back has not been government this time. It's been us, the organic sector, and the lack of unity and disagreements. And I would say more than anything else, this is what stopped us from getting a domestic standard. But rather than spend time on that bit of history, I think you've been actively involved now in bringing the industry together with a new industry group and having a united way forward, which to me is incredibly positive and long overdue. So, would you just like to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We'll have a new forum called the Organic Development Group, and it really is an informal coming together between the various organisations to agree that it's urgent now that we have a domestic regulation and to work out how to talk to each other because after while NASA was the first national organisation, it didn't assume that it was going to take on the functions of a peak body, and 30, 40 years later, we still don't have agreement about a peak body. So we're inhibited a bit in how we talk to government as an industry, which is why the Organic Development Group has this function of being able to sort of try and put a united voice. Still with disagreements about which standard we should use, which standard process we should use, and with fundamental disagreement about the role of the certifiers and their importance in that arrangement. I think that the modern view, the organic 3.0 view, if you would like, is that the certifiers are one voice within that process, and it's because historically they were the organisations that could operate nationally with the funding that they got from certification to be able to operate at that level. There's now the view that that era has passed, and we need to involve consumer organisations. We need to involve environmental organisations in and possibly in Australia, we need to talk to our Indigenous communities and involve them in this process because we want to say now that organic is a significant way of protecting the environment and protecting our healthy future.
Look, I strongly agree with you there. Part of the reason why, when I was president, we put out the concept of Organic 3.0, or IFAM put it out, is to not just being seen as bogged down in certification and standards, but as organic as a lighthouse. We offer so much
Mm.
in terms of the environment, climate change, fairness, the whole issue of animal cruelty. We start looking at a suite of issues that we're leaders of, and this is where we wanted to see ourselves as a good global citizen.
So certification remains really important, but it is a part of our industry. It shouldn't be the focus of our industry. It should be a tool and not an endpoint. And so some of the struggle that we have at the moment in Australia is sort of repositioning of those organisations to understand that there's a lot of management of those organisations that could be critical for us. For instance, I'm a strong advocate that that standard setting and certification and inspection are three different jobs, and they really don't belong within the same organisation. So, it may be that a certifier wants to employ its own inspectors, but in my view, that should be an independent operation. And the inspectors can have their own professional organisation, their own code of ethics, their own insurance arrangements, their own confidentiality agreements, that sort of thing. And that begins to take away some of the power of these certifiers. So it's not an easy transition, but I think it is a necessary transition. And I think that even some of the certifiers now begin to acknowledge that, okay, this is an inevitability of maturation of the industry over time.
And I think that's a good way of putting it. The maturation. When we first started, you know, we like you say, we invented it. didn't exist.
I was absolutely figuring out how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
It really was. And, we were fortunate because we, in the context of DDT being found in our exports and ALAR and chemical trespass, in that context, we did attract attention of some really good science people, and they helped us to understand how we were going to put this system together, how we were going to measure background chemical levels and MRLs and those sorts of things. But essentially, it was cobbled together by industry with the, uh, the the sort of go ahead from government to do this with a minimal expectation that government would actually become involved. And I think that one of the problems again that we have in Australia is that because we didn't have an agreed peak body, we've sort of slid towards more and more and more government engagement without there being a forum where we can sit down together with government and say, right, how are we going to do this? Who owns the standard? Who manages the standard? Who pays? And all the things that go with that, which should be negotiated.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I just wanted to say when you're saying about standard setting, certification, and inspection should be three different lots of organisations because putting them together is a huge conflict of interest because now these organisations
Yeah.
not only make the law, they are judge, jury, and executioner of that law.
Yes.
And nowhere does that work. That leads to all these problems down the track. So it's in the interest of the organic sector that they are split into separate organisations.
Yes. This has been a huge realization for some of my Australian colleagues to be a bit shocked to say, that as a standard setter and a certifier and an inspector, you have a fundamental conflict of interest. And I think that's an argument which is very winnable because it is, but it's been a big transition and something that they need to come to grips with, and it is working.
Yeah. The other one, which I think where Australia is just starting, there's been attempts at doing it, is PGS. When I was president of IFARM, we actually put a lot of effort into expanding it. We actually got United Nations behind us, and PGS is huge. In fact, more people, organic operators, are certified through PGS than any other system at the moment. And
It's
outside of
because of
the
our
sorry, yeah,
because of our remoteness in Australia. There's a few things that are happening around the world that we haven't entirely come to grips with yet. And PGS is fundamentally one of those. But the other one, I think, too, is the concept of organic varieties or organic breeds. And, Australia hasn't engaged enough with those ideas, which I know are very current in Europe and they have some currency in Asia. And the other problem that we have in Australia too is because, again, we have a very different environment. We could talk for hours about how different it is, really, and how our original settlers, white settlers in Australia, misunderstood and misinterpreted our environment. But because of that, we deal with these tropes about, for instance, the poverty of soils in Australia and how phosphorus deficient they are and those sorts of things, which leads our academy to not believe that organic can work in Australia. And if you try and talk to them about organic systems and you have the excellent examples that come out of, Rothamsted or Feeble or those sorts of, or Rodale Institute, they immediately want to say, "Oh, but Tim, you don't understand. Our soils are so poor; they're so positive, so negative in terms of their phosphorus and other nutrients." So that's something that we urgently need to do. We need to get some really good research in Australia that can show what good managers organic can be. Those original people that we dealt with in our youth from those institutions did not believe that organic survived, and it's a shock to them to know that we have organic operators coming to their 33rd and 34th and 35th inspection, annual
Yeah,
inspection. And so we need a bit of research into that, and also into environmental protection, how organic can protect our soils, our water, our air. And again, I guess that Rachel Carson raised the awareness of chemicals in food. We have a new era of awareness now where we're realizing not just chemicals in food, but the entire chemicalization of the environments of the
yeah,
world, of the ocean, of the air, and of the soil, and PFAS and other things which are coming to our attention now. And the sheer volume of chemicals that we put out into the environment. And we need to stress that to our consumers. We need to bring back the idea, which of the 70s and that time, of an organic lifestyle, because it can be that now organic is just that easy choice at the supermarket of an organic apple or a non-organic apple, but there's a whole lot of lifestyle choices that we need to advocate for to protect our future generations.
yeah. Yeah, look, the example of the environment, chemicals in the environment is critical. I live, a couple of kilometers away from here, is the Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest living organism, over 2,000 miles long. And it's in big trouble. And I know that people like to blame climate change. Climate change does cause bleaching, but bleaching is actually the way that coral adapts to climate change. It expels one lot of cyanobacteria. These are a symbiote organism that fixes glucose to feed the coral polyp. It expels it so it can be recolonized by one that's better adapted. So we're always hearing the reef's dying. It's climate change, but most of the reef recovers. But we've got all the areas um, of particularly cane farming, and that's where we see the dieback. It's not climate change; it's the herbicides and also the runoff, the silt that silts over and eutrophies
Yes.
the reef. And where I believe that one of our strong points is that we can stop that with organic. None of those chemicals, none of that soil runs off. We keep it on farm. And to me, I think it's a really important area that we need to focus on.
Yes. We need some good side-by-side studies where we look at your organic banana growing neighbours and their
Yeah,
conventional neighbours, and where we actually have a look at the water runoff into the reef. That's something that we're going to have a bit of effort to do, because the research system in Australia relies so much on industry funds. And of course, when you propose research like that to a body that's responsible for managing banana industry across Australia, they know very well what the outcome will be. They know that very well, and that's their disincentive. So we need a bit of lobbying to government so that we can show the public benefit, to be able to get some funding to do some of that work.
and
Or either that, or we need donors, but we don't have in Australia the history of philanthropy that they have, for instance, in the United States.
we don't have the history of philanthropy. It's the other way around. Yes, but I think the other one, which I think is really critical, is we actually in Australia, we've got a massive crisis. I call it a farming diaspora. We're losing farmers to debt. They're going out of business. And like you said, you've got organic farmers, 33rd, 35th, you know, inspection. You know, I've been farming organically. Well, I first started in '72, but I realized I had a lot to learn, so I apprenticed myself to an organic farmer. But um, I'm still farming now. We're picking today, picking pallet loads of fruit. But in my district here, the sugar mill just closed down because it's not viable. Years ago, I worked with the Mackay growers, and we were getting higher yields of organic sugar per hectare than the conventional. And at that stage in Australia, our processors were importing organic sugar from Brazil 7 times the world price.
Mm.
I took that to our mill districts and said, look, even if it's 2 times the world price, I can get you a higher yield and double the price. And they were interested, but then they just said, no, nah, it can't be done, that sort of attitude. And to the point now where farmers, because they've got so much debt, they're selling their farms off to pay the banks because they no longer um, make sugarcane and because we don't have a mill. And this is the other
Mm.
problem I see when we're trying to grow it up. We have, farmers would rather go bankrupt than make a good living being organic. And this is another area where we need to get change, get information out.
I think the viticulture industry is a terrific example for that in Australia because originally they were of the view that we just can't, we'll never survive disease in our industry without without chemicals. And now I have like one of my local world-class primo wine producing areas. The McLaren Vale is now 50% certified organic and biodynamic. And the story of how they came to that realization is really interesting. They had the advantage that that perhaps organic that viticulturists understand the concept of terroir. They understand the
Mm.
importance of that what you put in the soil will have an outcome. They understood perhaps that that they had an image problem with whether their product could be healthy or not, and that going to organic maybe facilitated that in some ways. For a lot of the smaller growers, they rely on cellar door sales, so inviting the community into their property and being able to say, yes, you can bring the kids, they can run around, it's safe here, uh, and some good science also around that, and some really genuine biological products now that are you're dealing with chemicals. This is an enormous transition that
Yeah.
we always knew that we could influence chemical the disease in orchards or in vines with small physical changes like how you aligned the rows to the prevailing wind and getting sunlight into the vines and those sorts of things. We didn't really understand in the early days that we could actually go completely away from chemicals in favor of biological products, which we now have particular strains of fungi and bacteria and other things that we can actually purchase in a bottle and apply. And the early application of integrated pest management sort of didn't achieve what it could because they were trying to integrate a pesticide management system. Whereas when you went to an organic property, you could see that they were integrating the entire system. So they were integrating things like uh, their selection of where they were going to plant. The McLaren Vale is a maritime environment with an escarpment behind that produces katabatic winds. They were integrating the entire management of the soil and the biodiversity of of their growing environment. So the integration became rather than a small integration of the chemical system, it became the integration of the entire ecosystem. And that McLaren Vale, for instance, is a good example of 40 years ago. There was a lot of chemical trespass across that area. And so that, the issue of moving towards less chemical dependent sort of agriculture was really vital for them to preserve that industry in an area where they share it with uh, residential use.
Yeah. I think the viticulture industry is one of the best, not just in Australia, but worldwide. For instance, in um, Europe, um, the biodynamic
Mm.
farmers, vineyards, were winning huge amounts of awards,
Yes.
excessive amount, and yet at that point they were 0.4%
Yes.
of the vineyards. But that made all the other vignerons take notice, saying, how come these guys who are virtually nothing are winning? And as you said, it's that awareness of terroir, of soil and place.
Mm.
And so you start to see all these farmers going from ridiculing biodynamics to actually um, picking it up, becoming organic. And as you say, that then you move to a more holistic management system. So for me, the wine industry is probably one of our best examples. But the other one we're starting to see now, also as a really good example, are the grass-fed organic systems,
Yeah.
pasture-based systems.
The regenerative concept is really helping to open the minds of farmers to what's possible with simple management systems. And I think that I now encounter quite a few people who 20 years ago would have said, I just can't see a pathway to being organic. I'd love to be organic, but I can't see a pathway. And now we might have a few disputes about, with the regenerative movement about, the nature of the claims that are made, which don't at the moment match the verification systems that organic certification has. But that industry is at a stage now where organic was 40 years ago, and they'll need to come to grips with how they manage their verification systems. But it does allow farmers to have a really rapid, quick response to that they can see in a matter of a year or two of management, to how they manage their pastures, and that opens the opportunity for people to be able to see, yep, maybe this is my way where I could become organic.
Yeah, look, for me, it's myself, Ronnie Cummings, Vandana Shiva, and a few others. Um, when we started Regeneration International, we started the international regenerative movement. Before we did it, hardly anyone heard of the word.
Yeah.
It's rarely used. Now we put it there, and the reason why is because um, industrial agriculture is an existential threat. Um, you know, on every level, but for farmers at the moment, most farmers in industrial agriculture are struggling under a mountain of debt. And there's very few who, who don't believe anything should change. And to use the term regenerative, regenerating agriculture, it's a neutral term. And, the example I'll give here, that the farmers would rather go bankrupt than go organic. But if we start them on the pathway, which is what we wanted to do, that paradigm
Yeah.
shift in changing, suddenly organic is not so far away. It's achievable. It's reachable. And
Yes.
and this is what we we aim to do. And I get a bit disappointed at times when people in the organic industry are probably the biggest critics of regeneration. They see it as a threat. rather than realizing it's actually the organic sector's biggest opportunity to work with these people and show them now they've got an easy pathway to be certified.
Yes. You know that my company that I helped to run, TM Organics, helped to convert a lot of people to organic. And I saw some problems there with that term of conversion
Yeah,
because it had this sort of road to Damascus sort of
religious.
impact, and the
Mm,
idea that you had to go cold turkey. And so in helping over 600 organic farmers to, to change their management system, I preferred to use the word transition
yeah,
because
I'm the
it
same.
it
Sorry.
allowed people to believe that they could step by step change their system. And for instance, working with cereal farmers who just, that look at, you know, 20,000 acres of farm, which you can easily have in Australia,
Mm,
and not being able to understand how you could do that. And we were able to say to them, you've got a 3-year conversion period that you're going to require. Just take one paddock, right? Take one paddock through its transition, and then you'll develop some confidence with that system. You'll see it working. So now, each year you can add another paddock into your transition program, and eventually you can, transition the farm over time. But that was a little bit unique because prior to that, the organic movement had promoted this idea of a one stage conversion, drop the chemicals and and go organic.
yeah, and what you did, I thought was really important. I remember very much the way you did it, and I was always very, very impressed that that's the way forward because um, most farmers are actually very frightened of change. Farmers, we tend to be very
Oh,
conservative
absolutely. Yeah.
because if we take risks, we have crop failure, the bank owns us. And so the
Yeah.
way you do it is the way I always work with
Yeah.
farmers. Just
Yeah.
take a small part of your farm,
Yeah.
not your best bit. You don't want to make it too easy,
Yeah.
not your worst bit.
Yes.
You don't want to set yourself up for failure. Get a reasonable
Yeah.
bit and start that because whenever you do something new, you make mistakes, but you work on the concept of
Look,
continuous improvement. How do I do it better next time? And
yeah.
get it
It's
right
scary
and
enough
scale
now,
it up.
but
Sorry?
it's scary enough now. But
Yeah,
40 years ago, it was really, really, really scary because you had simply almost nowhere you could go. If you
yeah,
didn't belong to those local organic organizations, and sometimes if you lived in the Australian bush, you were a long way
yeah,
from, your
isolated.
colleagues.
Yeah,
Um, so, and even now, if you live in the right place, you can go into your rural supply shop and you can say, I'm going to be organic. But if you live in the wrong place, and you say, what chemicals, organic chemicals, can you sell me because I'm converting? It's likely someone will look at you and say, "What are you doing that for?" You know,
uh,
uh,
it's
there's
probably not
just
even that polite a word. It's
yeah,
probably fuck off out of here.
yeah, yeah.
No,
Well,
that
we're going to a big audience here. I'm trying to
yeah.
be
So I probably shouldn't
polite,
let
but
people know how the vernacular is used in rural Australia, but
yes,
that that from my experience is the polite way of telling you that you're not
yes,
going to
yeah.
get it.
But look, even that's transitioning. I think I see young people, agronomists who are aware of climate change. They're aware of chemicalization of the environment. They see, that we must change. And possibly some of them are also saying, how do I how do I manufacture my future in this industry? What can I do that can identify me with a growth path into the future? And so some of those people now are turning to what we used to call biological agriculture, which we
Yeah,
now possibly call regenerative, and even to this awareness of organic. So you now get people who can say, yeah, we have those products, we can help you. And that in itself has been an enormous transition in the ease and ability of people to change their farming system in a more holistic way.
yeah. So lastly, I just want to end on this is um, in Australia, we are losing so many farmers. The majority of farmers look like us.
Mm.
You don't have a younger generation um, coming on. A lot of farmers are walking off their farms or selling it because of debt, because the bank owns them. But we, in this case, the organic sector, we are the great success story. While industrial agriculture is losing farmers, we are growing them. And what I'm really excited about is we've got the next generation interested in farming. We're the only people doing that at scale now.
Yeah, we still have a problem of capital because, how do young people move to land? And so we need some new models around how to bring people into agriculture. I think that PGS has a role there, and community supported agriculture definitely has a role in that. It is a way that people can make um, uh, a, a move into agricultural production in a different way, where they can perhaps use someone else's land. In some cases, they can use that land while adding value to the land and not interfering with other operations that are ongoing on that land, and where they have some unique possibilities, such as being able to talk to a bank and have a concept of future income, for instance, which is very rare in agriculture. In community supported agriculture, you can actually say, you know, here's my future income for the next 12 months. So that we need more models like that to move young people into agriculture.
Yeah. But, so, the thing is, we're getting these models. From my point of view, as someone who's involved in farming on every continent, because of my international work, I see us as the lighthouse in agriculture
Yes,
and mostly good news stories.
yes, good.
So, anyway, Tim, I just want to thank you very much for everything you've done. It's been, you know, your role has been really significant in taking Australia to where we are now. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Andre, and thank you back to you because you had an important role in that too, and in that 2000 decade. When you were the leader of the Organic Federation of Australia, I think that was absolutely critical in giving us that Australian standard, which I think is the future for how we will manage organic in Australia, and also your work at iPhone and with regenerative agriculture. So thank you also.
Okay, thanks, Tim. All the
Thanks.
best.
And I look forward to seeing you again soon in some part of the world.
Right, and ditto, the same here. We'll catch up.
Good day. Thank
Ciao.
you. Bye.